Good morning, Spartans. Happy Wednesday, May 11th. You can see the agenda here today. I'm going to wrap up World War I and talk about the last of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, the League of Nations. We'll talk about how World War I, is settled by the Allied powers. You have a video to watch regarding registration for next year. There's been some changes, and they're going to reopen registration. And then you have the next section to read in chapter 28, questions 1 through 10. That'll be the homework for tomorrow. Make sure today you turn in the chapter 27 reading guide. That is due today, so we want to make sure that whole thing is done. Let's change plans here. I will forget this at the end of the video. On the homepage for World History, on the homepage, there is the link or the embedded video for next year's registration. Obviously, it's buffering in this video as I just added it to the Google Drive. But you should, by the time class starts at 8:30 here, see this video. It's 9 minutes long. Why don't you stop my video, go into Schoology, watch this, and get the information from Ms. Powers Johnson. All right, I'm back. If I'm not mistaken, registration is being opened up for a time period as Simley adds a business department for next year. If you have any questions regarding registration, the business department, I don't have any information regarding it. Talk to your counselor, as I just got this video sent to me tonight. End of World War I. All right, we talked about how Woodrow Wilson yesterday had 14 points. It was his exit strategy. The United States was going to get into this conflict. We wanted to know what the outcome was going to look like. We wanted to know what the post-World War I world would look like. The last part of Woodrow Wilson's exit strategy was setting up the League of Nations. This was the 14th point. This was a group that was going to be put together, made up of representatives from all around the world to handle any sort of international dispute, right? In previous centuries, if you had a dispute with another country, you went to war. Obviously, we wanted to stop that. We realized that wars were harsh on economic development, expansion. They were hard on keeping people, countries, governments in power. They caused more disruption than they did in solving problems. So the League of Nations was his 14th point. And again, it was meant to make sure that these conflicts didn't happen again. It was the final component to peace without victory. But here's the thing that Woodrow Wilson didn't realize right away. The British and the French, George Clemenceau and David Lloyd George, they were not about to accept peace without victory. They had been at war with the Central Powers for 4 years. They had suffered millions of casualties. They spent billions of dollars. Their industries were destroyed. Their countries were destroyed. It was a huge, huge ordeal. And they weren't just going to say, they seem like nice guys over there in Germany. No, it was not going to happen. They wanted to stick it to them for what they had done. Wilson finally realized what he was dealing with. Clemenceau from France wanted to ensure that Germany wasn't going to be able to invade again. George from England had political promises that he had made to really twist the screws on the Germans, and he wasn't going to acquiesce from it. When Wilson finally realized this, he understood the fact that he was going to have to be amicable, or at least amendable, to his first 13 points of his exit strategy. All right, he may have to accept that the French and the British are going to twist the screws on the Germans, and he would accept that if they agreed to establishing the League of Nations. This was kind of his brainchild, and in exchange for accepting and creating the League of Nations, obviously we're going to start talking about now how the British and the French just absolutely go after the Germans. All right, the 14 points that Woodrow Wilson did propose as the United States entered and ultimately won World War I, ultimately became the framework for the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles is the end. It's the official document that ends World War I. New nations will be created, mostly in Eastern Europe along ethnic lines. Territories that were controlled by the losing belligerent nations, so the colonies or territories of Germany, Austria-Hungary, Bulgaria, and the Ottoman Ottoman Turks, the Ottoman Empire. They get one of a couple of things happen. They gain their independence. They get divided up and split between other nations, like what the British and the French do with the Middle East. And that's what ultimately gets us into this conflict between the Palestinians and the Israelis today. Or some of these territories were more or less separated from their European colonizers, but they were more or less left under the influence, if not the control, of a superior European country until that African or Middle Eastern or Asian territory developed, developed themselves culturally until they could, control their own country. Interestingly enough, when you negotiate peace terms, you would think that both sides would come to the table to negotiate how they were going to end the war. That was not the case. Central power countries were not a part of the negotiations. What the British and the French wanted is what the British and the French got, and they definitely got their peace, and they got their peace with victory. Germany gets stripped of its military. Germany gets stripped of its colonies and territories. Germany gets assessed with a $33 billion reparations, meaning they're going to have to pay the British and the French and the Allies for what they had done. They more or less forced them to accept fault and blame for World War I, for causing World War I, which doesn't really seem like it's a big deal. You wouldn't think that it would be such a big deal to accept blame for something. But then think about it this way. Think about how many times you've had an argument with someone or you got into a fight with someone and your parents made you apologize. You had to apologize to the person that you got into a fight with. And then think about how that made you feel, because that's how the Germans felt. That's why this is a big deal. Think about all those little scuffles you got in growing up. Just absolute screaming matches, arguments, or maybe even a little rough and tumble back and forth. And then it got broken up by your parents. Maybe it's oftentimes with a brother or sister. And then think about when your parents made you apologize. You were not sorry, I can guarantee it, but you still had to apologize, and that was probably the worst thing about it. This will come back and haunt. This will come back and haunt these European countries as a reason why World War II will start. Interestingly enough, new major players in international affairs, the Soviet Union, will be left out of negotiations. Asian countries, such as the Japanese, will not necessarily gain what they thought they were entitled to from World War I. The map, I believe I showed some of you this yesterday. You can obviously see how the map changes. The Soviet Union loses a significant amount of territory when they left World War I and signed a peace deal with the Germans. That territory that was supposed to be the Germans, obviously they lose when they lose the war. You can see a significant number of countries being established on the eastern half of Europe. And again, it's all these ethnic lines, or all along ethnic lines. Ultimately, a war that took 4 years to fight and cost millions of people's lives and billions of dollars to pay for was hugely and significantly a waste of time. It didn't solve any of the problems that it hoped to solve. And then in the peace deal, the peace deal that was supposed to end it didn't do anything either. The Treaty of Versailles was a monumental failure. Woodrow Wilson's idea for a peace without victory, while might have been noble, probably should have been the right thing to do, did not get followed. And what was put together was just a colossal cluster. The Germans are humiliated. They are stripped of any sort of ability to make amends for their actions. They have zero opportunity to actually pay the reparations that they owe. I mean, they're stripped of their colonies, they're stripped of territory, they're stripped of military, they're stripped of more or less international trade. How are they going to pay countries back if they have no ability to make money? They don't have any resources, they don't have any factories. I mean, they are set up for failure. Even though Russia wasn't a instigator of World War I, even though they didn't lose World War I, somehow they lost more land than the Germans. Doesn't necessarily make sense. This constant desire for nationalism, or this constant presence of nationalism, and colonial peoples, or smaller in number ethnic peoples wanting to be independent, Doesn't necessarily come to fruition either. I mean, in some places it does. Okay, the Poles will get their independence. There'll be a group of Slavics along the Baltic Sea that gets their independence, right? But Yugoslavia is a country that imploded in the 1990s. It's because it's filled with, a dozen or so different ethnicities. Not every ethnic group gets their independence. All right. And then the last thing that ultimately makes the World War I just a waste of time, because we fight a second world war for the same reasons. And the peace treaty, an absolute failure, is that Woodrow Wilson's League of Nations does get created, but the United States never joins it. The United States Senate never ratifies that part of the treaty. They never ratify that treaty. They actually got to sign a different treaty with the Central Powers. They don't join the League of Nations. And when they don't join the League of Nations has no credibility. Right? It's like when your parents go out of town and they leave your, slightly older brother or sister to be in charge of you. You're not listening. It's not happening. It's the exact same thing. The British, the French, whomever's a part of the League of Nations, all fine and dandy, but unless you've got the spank of the United States military behind you, it's not going to mean anything. The United States doesn't join the League of Nations because, again, the United States is absolutely horrendously terrified about being sucked into another world war or being sucked into another series of European problems. So we don't ratify it. We don't join what Woodrow Wilson thought would be a hugely successful international peacekeeping opportunity. All these things considered, the status of the world continues to worsen after World War I. Wilson's 14 points, his exit strategy, more or less one by one, either isn't implemented or isn't carried out to the fullest or isn't maintained. As a result of those things, we inch back closer and closer to war. And then on top of that, the world is on the absolute precipice or cliff of a significant financial downturn, which is more or less actually caused by the end of World War I, which is what you guys are going to read about and what we're going to talk about tomorrow when I'm finally back in class. If you haven't watched the senior registration guide video, get that done. Chapter 28, questions 1 through 10, it's open, it's shared with you. You guys should be good. We're going to start looking at the financial situation that comes up post World War I. Remember, again, chapter 27 reading guide, get it turned in. 1 through 10 for tomorrow, and the video guide, the registration video. If you've got questions about next year and the business department, email your counselors. I'll be in about 8 o'clock Thursday morning if anybody needs to make up a test. Thursday and Friday, period 6 and 7, I will be available if anybody needs to make up a test. What was the last thing I needed to update you guys on? I did update grades on Tuesday. Your grades were fully updated. All the missing work was in Tuesday before I left for golf, so they are relatively current. Quite a few Fs, more than I've ever had all year combined in this one trimester. So we need to get some work in. Remember, you have a deadline Friday at 3:20. Anything from last week or prior is due by 3:20 on Friday. Hope you're all doing well. We'll see you guys tomorrow. And obviously, go Spartans.